To help understand what's happening in France, we're joined now from Paris by Jacques Rolland. He's the head of European research at the Global Policy Institute. Good to have you on the program. Is it clear to you that the police were overtly brutal in addressing the Yellow Vest protests?
Yes, you can say that because actually a lot of people were injured. But at the same time, you have to admit that the level of violence on the part of the demonstrations were also, or the demonstrators were unprecedented, and therefore uh, much not controlled at all. This demonstration this time, the French police is used to dealing with the big demonstrations. It started in 1968 with the huge riots that took place there. And now, since then, every 1 or 2 years, there's been big protest movements leading to sometimes violent actions. Uh, but this time they were of very different nature because these movements were not stewarded by unions. It was completely without leaders, uncontrolled. We did not know exactly what they wanted. But at the same time, in this movement, mix a lot of people and people from the outside, not interested in the Gilets jaunes, but just wanted to have action, which were black blocs, for example. So the level of violence led uh, to the police having to resort to new tactics and
Mhm.
also to use new forces who are different from the gendarmes and CRS who are traditionally used
Right.
in order to take care of this
Right.
demonstration.
But Jacques, when we look at the aftermath, the fact that those flashballs and sting bell grenades were used, and when we see that people were blinded, they were mutilated, people lost arms and testicles and eyes and all sorts of things, with all of that in mind, should the state be looking at it now and saying, perhaps, even though there were militant elements within the protests, we shouldn't have done that?
Yes, they're thinking that maybe we should have responded differently, but as they said, they were taken by surprise and they started applying. The French police thinks they are the kings when it comes, the world leaders when it comes to maintaining public order, and don't often look at other forces experienced in other countries. So now, this time, after these riots, the Home Secretary Castaner has said that they would be looking back at the way they handle
Yeah,
such demonstrations, and
right.
they might be inspired by the model, by other models such as the German or the British models of crowd
Right.
control.
Jacques, did you read Emmanuel Macron's interview in The New Yorker?
When was that?
It just came out in Monday. Something interesting, by the way, so I'll bring you up to speed.
Yeah,
When he was
okay.
asked if he feels he could have done more or he should have responded more aggressively, he said, I did that because I didn't want to reduce the level of freedom in this country, i.e., not going stronger. He said, I think that would have been a mistake. But this is the interesting line for me. He said, but to think that we are just speaking about normal citizens demonstrating, I mean, that is pure BS. That's what he said.
Ah,
So, I
okay.
mean, if you're a protester, if you weren't one of those people who actually committed an act of violence, you were just there protesting fuel taxes, angry, upset that things are not going well, and your president says this about you, that you're not a normal citizen demonstrating, you're not going to be very happy about that, are you?
No, maybe the choice of words might not be the best, but it's true. It's a fact that people who went and took part in these demonstrations after the 1st of December, when we saw this level of violence around the Arc de Triomphe and the level of police response, because now the French police has been using rubber bullets and LPDs, which have been the main reasons for the injuries. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
they should know that when you get into such unauthorized, very often demonstration, you run a risk. And it's up to the citizens to uh, measure the risk and see whether they're ready to do it. And they've taken some measures which have been considered maybe as
Right.
an attempt on civil liberties by stopping and searching people before they get to the demonstration. But I suppose in that case, the circumstances
Right.
required it.
Something that seems to be a rebuttal to this idea that there was something unique to Gilets jaunes and the nature of the protests which led to the violence is an Amnesty International report that came out at the end of last year, which was following the protests at schools, right? And the way the French police sort of put them down. And Amnesty International said, as the clouds of tear gas lift, a clearer picture has emerged which shows police have used excessive force against largely peaceful protesters, journalists, and even children. So then I ask you, are we maybe giving too much credit to the police here, where we're saying, well, these were unique circumstances with yellow vests, and that's why they're brutal, whereas Amnesty is saying this was even heavy-handed when it came to school protests?
Yes, it was at times. And it's true that the police in France has not a very good reputation. They can be very heavy-handed. They've been involved in, they've developed some techniques of controls, especially in the suburbs of France, in the suburbs of Paris, where there's been quite a lot of unrest on a daily basis, but also, if you remember, the big demonstration of 2005. And they've created some special squads, which were actually we call anti-criminality squad, which have been using, as I said earlier, have different methods from the gendarmes and so on. And they're the ones who've used these rubber bullets, these LBD guns, which were introduced by Sarkozy's interior minister in the year 2007. So, and it's true that in France, there is the tradition of the police never been really seriously judged in case of a problem. Like, for example, this time, there's been about nearly 400 complaints against individual policemen.
Yes.
And none of them has been tried yet, while the demonstrators have all been tried. And the police, in the case of when it involves complaining against the police, you have to first call on the police inspectorate, which looks at the behavior of policemen, and then it's taken to a prosecutor, and then the judgment, which or never happened.
Right. And
so there's a impunity
certainly
to the police.
Yeah, and for context, at least 2,000 policemen have been injured during this protest season and during this the entire dramatic event. So, you know, it's fascinating to see the standoff. The protests are smaller than they were. Now, very finally, Jacques, the UN wanted to go in and investigate. The French said, no, we'll investigate ourselves. Thank you very much. And the UN Human Rights Office compared France's treatment of the protesters to that of Sudan and Haiti. How much must that have annoyed the French government that the UN put it in the same sentence as those two countries?
I suppose they took it with a pinch of salt. Because one of the things you can say about the French police, they can be violent, that's true, but they haven't killed anyone since 1986. Actually, it's part of their philosophy, because they know that if there is a death in the demonstration, then it means victory for the demonstrators. So that's the one thing that the French police always tries to avoid is a casualty, a lethal casualty. They have injuries, and there's been many over the last few years, whether in student demonstration, whether in a demonstration against homosexual marriage, etc. There's been all kinds of. France has a tradition of violence. You have to live with that. France accepts it, the people accept it. And you know, if you go to, even in my young days, myself, I've been beaten up by policemen demonstrating. It's part and parcel of growing up in France. We know that we have a police force which can be very heavy-handed, but at the same time, we also know that we have the protection of the law. We have we can have solicitors, but it's true. It's very difficult to to sentence the police when they're doing wrongly, as has been the case, in many affairs in the last few years, especially in the Paris suburbs, where young men died as a result of police action. Not part of the demonstration, but police control in this suburb.
Yeah, something that we want to discuss and broaden this out to maybe at another time is the concept of racial and economic disparity when it comes to how the police deal with different French citizens. I want to do that with a panel because I think that would be fascinating to explore. But for the moment, let me thank you, Jacques. Jacques Rolland, thanks for joining us on the Newsmakers.